The morning sunlight streamed through the dusty classroom windows, filling the room with a soft golden glow. Students sat at their desks, some doodling in their notebooks, others whispering quietly to their friends. It was just another ordinary school day, but for Marcus, it felt different. His heart beat a little faster, and his palms were slightly sweaty, because today the teacher had promised the class a special activity. Everyone would get a chance to stand up and share what they wanted to become when they grew up. At first, the students were excited. Some laughed and shouted out answers before it was even their turn. One boy said he wanted to be a famous basketball player, and the whole class cheered. Another girl said she wanted to become a singer, and her friends clapped loudly. The teacher smiled at some of these answers, nodding along politely, but Marcus could tell that the teacher wasn't taking them too seriously. It felt more like a game than a moment to share their real dreams. But for Marcus, it wasn't a game at all. He had been waiting for this day. He had been carrying a dream inside his heart for months, maybe even years, and now he finally had a chance to speak it out loud. He wanted the world to know, even if that world was only his classroom of noisy students and one strict teacher. When the teacher called on Marcus, the room grew a little quieter. Marcus slowly stood up. His voice trembled at first, but he cleared his throat and spoke clearly. "When I grow up," he said, "I want to go to Harvard University." The words hung in the air like something magical, something different from all the other answers. For a moment, there was silence. Some students looked confused, a few raised their eyebrows, and others tilted their heads as if they weren't even sure what Harvard was. Marcus stood tall, his eyes shining with determination. He continued, "I want to study law there, and one day, I want to be a lawyer who helps people." The silence didn't last long. A few giggles started at the back of the class. Then more laughter followed. The sound spread quickly, bouncing off the walls until it felt like the whole room was laughing at him. Marcus could feel the heat rising in his cheeks, but he clenched his fists at his side, refusing to back down. The teacher didn't laugh right away. Instead, she narrowed her eyes and gave Marcus a look that made his stomach twist. Finally, she let out a sharp chuckle. "Harvard?" she said, dragging out the word. "Marcus, let's be realistic. That's a very big dream. Maybe you should think about something a little more practical, something that fits better for you." The laughter from the students grew louder. Some even mimicked his words, repeating Harvard in a mocking tone. Marcus felt like the walls were closing in. He had thought his dream would inspire respect, maybe even admiration, but instead it had become the target of cruel jokes. Inside, Marcus wanted to shout. He wanted to tell them that he had already read about Harvard, that he knew about the long history of leaders and thinkers who studied there. He wanted to explain that he spent his evenings in the small library near his house, reading about law, justice, and people who changed the world. He wanted to say that he believed with all his heart that one day he would walk across Harvard's campus with pride, but his voice caught in his throat. The teacher waved her hand as if dismissing his answer. "All right, let's move on," she said, calling on another student. The attention shifted away from Marcus, but the damage was already done. He sank back into his chair, his heart heavy but still burning with determination. Marcus stared at his desk, tracing the edge of his notebook with his finger. He could still hear the echoes of laughter, but beneath it all, he heard something else, a quiet voice inside him whispering, "Don't give up, one day, you'll prove them wrong." As the rest of the students continued sharing their dreams, Marcus stayed quiet. He didn't laugh at their answers, he didn't roll his eyes or mock them. Instead, he listened, wondering why dreaming big was so unacceptable for him but fine for others. Why was wanting to be a singer or an athlete seen as fun, but wanting to go to Harvard was treated like a joke? By the time the activity was over, Marcus's spirit felt bruised, but not broken. He knew the road ahead of him would be difficult. He knew there would be more people like his teacher, people ready to doubt him, laugh at him, and tell him to stay small. But deep down, he made a promise to himself. He would hold on to his dream, no matter how many people tried to take it away. The bell rang, and the students rushed out into the hallway, still chattering and laughing. Marcus picked up his backpack slowly, walking out with his head lowered. But even as he left the classroom, his dream stayed with him, strong and alive, waiting for the day when he would finally prove everyone wrong. Marcus walked home that afternoon with heavy steps. His classmates' laughter still rang in his ears like an echo that wouldn't fade. The teacher's dismissive chuckle replayed over and over in his mind, and for a brief moment, he almost wished he had said something ordinary, something safe like basketball player or singer. But deep down, Marcus knew he could not lie about his dream. not even to protect himself from ridicule. That night, as the world outside his small apartment grew quiet, Marcus sat by the window with a book resting in his lap. It was one of the library books he had borrowed last week, thick and heavy, about the history of Harvard University. The pages smelled old, but to Marcus, they smelled like possibility. Each word he read painted pictures in his mind of tall red brick buildings, libraries filled with knowledge, and students walking with confidence. He closed his eyes and imagined himself there, wearing a suit, carrying books, preparing to argue a case in court one day. The bold dream of Harvard wasn't something Marcus picked at random. It wasn't a fancy name he heard once and decided to copy. For months, even years, Marcus had been quietly building this dream brick by brick in his heart. He had first discovered Harvard while reading about famous leaders in history. People who had walked through its halls had gone on to become judges, lawyers, presidents, and changemakers. Marcus thought, if they could do it, why can't I? Every evening after finishing his homework, Marcus would spend hours reading. He devoured books on law, biographies of great leaders, and articles about how Harvard students trained to think critically. His mother often found him asleep at the table, his head resting on an open book. She would gently shake him awake and whisper, "Marcus, you'll hurt your neck sleeping like that." But even in his half-asleep state, Marcus would smile and murmur, "One day, Mom, I'm going to Harvard." Unlike the kids in his class who dreamed of fame or money, Marcus's dream came from something deeper. He had seen the struggles in his neighborhood, families fighting for justice, friends getting in trouble because they didn't know their rights. He wanted to be the one who stood up for them, a lawyer who could make a difference. That dream burned brighter than the laughter he had endured earlier. The next day at school, Marcus sat quietly. The whispers about him hadn't stopped. Some students still teased him, calling him Mr. Harvard as he walked past. Others rolled their eyes, acting as if his dream was nothing more than a silly fantasy. But Marcus didn't answer back. He simply smiled faintly and carried his books close to his chest, because in his heart he knew something they didn't. Dreams don't die just because others laugh at them. Later that week, the teacher asked the class to write a short essay about their future. Most students wrote casually, filling the page with simple sentences about wanting to play sports, become a musician, or work in an easy job. Marcus, however, poured his entire heart into his essay. He wrote about why Harvard meant so much to him, how he wanted to study law to defend the innocent, and how education was his ticket to break free from the limits society placed on him. When he turned in the essay, Marcus didn't expect much. He figured the teacher might skim through it, maybe shake her head again. But something unexpected happened. That very essay caught the attention of someone far beyond his classroom walls. One afternoon, Marcus's principal walked into the class holding a small stack of papers. He smiled warmly and announced that the school had decided to send some student essays to a regional competition. "We wanted essays that show vision, passion, and courage," he said, "and one of those essays comes from our very own Marcus." The class went silent. For once, nobody laughed. Marcus felt a wave of shock and pride wash over him. He hadn't expected his words to travel beyond his teacher's desk. He hadn't expected that people outside this room would recognize the fire in his dream. As the weeks passed, Marcus's essay traveled further than he imagined. It reached educators, mentors, and eventually found its way into the hands of someone connected to Harvard. His bold dream, written with honesty and hope, had carried his voice to places he had only dared to picture in his imagination. Back in the classroom, Marcus sat taller in his chair. He no longer cared about the whispers or the mocking nicknames. He knew his dream was no longer just his own. It was alive in the minds of people who believed in him. It had become more than a fantasy. It was turning into a story. Yet, Marcus still carried the memory of that day when he first spoke up. The way his teacher mocked him in front of everyone replayed in his mind like a scar. But instead of letting it wound him, he used it as fuel. Every laugh became motivation. Every doubt became a stepping stone. Marcus thought, if I stop now, they'll win. If I keep going, one day I'll prove them all wrong. At night, he continued his routine, reading, studying, imagining. He saw himself walking across Harvard Yard, shaking hands with professors, and one day, standing in a courtroom, speaking on behalf of those who couldn't speak for themselves. His dream wasn't just about him. It was about proving to every child who had been told they were not good enough that they were. The bold dream had started in a small classroom, spoken by a boy with trembling hands, mocked by a teacher who couldn't see past stereotypes. But that same dream was now growing stronger, spreading wider, reaching places Marcus never thought possible, and soon, that dream would open doors no one expected. The day Marcus spoke his dream aloud was one he would never forget. The air in the classroom had shifted in an instant. First came the silence, sharp and heavy, then the whispers, then the laughter that rolled across the room like a cruel wave. But what cut deeper than anything else was not the students' laughter, it was the teacher's reaction. Mrs. Thompson was a woman known for her sternness. She kept her hair tied neatly in a bun, her glasses perched on the edge of her nose, and her voice sharp enough to silence even the rowdiest students. Many children in the school feared her, and Marcus had always believed that somewhere deep down she cared. After all, teachers were supposed to believe in their students, weren't they? But as Marcus stood there, his voice trembling but determined, telling the class that he wanted to attend Harvard and become a lawyer, Mrs. Thompson's expression hardened. Instead of encouragement, her lips curled into a smirk. She tilted her head slightly, adjusting her glasses as though she had misheard him. Harvard, she repeated, dragging out the word as if it were too heavy for Marcus's mouth. Her tone was not filled with curiosity, but with disbelief. The class leaned in, waiting for her response. Some students were already giggling, nudging each other. But when Mrs. Thompson chuckled, a sharp, mocking sound, the giggles exploded into open laughter. It was as if her reaction gave them permission to ridicule Marcus without holding back. "Marcus," she said, her voice coated in false sweetness, "it's good to have dreams, but we must also be realistic. Harvard is one of the most elite universities in the entire world. It's not for everyone, and certainly not for, well, students who should focus on more achievable goals." Her words hung in the air like icy smoke. Marcus's chest tightened. He wanted to shout, to explain that he had been reading about Harvard for months, that he studied harder than anyone in that class, that he stayed up late learning things beyond their school books. But his voice felt trapped. His classmates' laughter rose again, filling his ears, stabbing at his heart. One boy at the back cupped his hands around his mouth and called out, "Hey, Mr. Harvard, maybe you'll be president next." Heh. The class burst into laughter once more. Marcus forced himself to stay still. His fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. Mrs. Thompson didn't stop the laughter. She simply shook her head as if Marcus had told a ridiculous joke. "Dreams should match reality, Marcus," she said. "It's not good to set yourself up for disappointment. Perhaps you should think about a trade, something with your hands, something more practical." The words sliced through Marcus like a blade. He felt the heat of embarrassment crawling up his neck, his eyes stinging with unshed tears. But he refused to let them fall. Crying now would only prove them right. Instead, he stared at the floor, silently repeating to himself, "Don't give up, don't let them win." The cruel thing about Mrs. Thompson's reaction was not just her words, it was the message behind them. She wasn't only saying that Harvard was out of reach. She was saying that Marcus, a young black boy from a struggling neighborhood, was not allowed to dream beyond what she thought he deserved. She had placed him in a box and slammed the lid shut. For the rest of the lesson, Marcus sat quietly. His classmates occasionally shot glances his way, some with smirks, others with mock sympathy, but none with understanding. The laughter faded eventually, replaced by the usual noise of pencils scratching and pages turning. But Marcus couldn't hear it. His ears still rang with her words. At lunch, the whispers continued. A group of boys imitated him, standing tall and saying in exaggerated voices, "I want to go to Harvard. I'll be a lawyer. I'll save the world." They laughed so hard they nearly choked on their food. Marcus walked past them without looking, but every step felt heavier. That evening, at home, Marcus didn't tell his mother the details of what happened. She asked about school, and he simply shrugged. "It was fine," he said. But later, when he was alone, he replayed the scene in his mind over and over. He thought about the way Mrs. Thompson's eyes narrowed, the way she dismissed his dream as if it were too ridiculous to even entertain. He sat at his desk and opened his notebook. On the first blank page, he wrote in big letters, "Harvard is possible." Underneath, he wrote it again and again, filling the page with the same phrase until it became a chant, a promise to himself. What Mrs. Thompson didn't realize was that her mockery had sparked something inside Marcus. Yes, her words had hurt. They had bruised his spirit. But they also lit a fire. He thought, if even my teacher thinks I can't do it, then I'll just have to prove her wrong. In the weeks that followed, Marcus noticed subtle changes in how she treated him. Whenever he raised his hand, she often ignored him or called on someone else. Whenever he answered a question correctly, she gave only the briefest acknowledgement. As if she didn't want to admit he was capable, her dismissal became routine. But Marcus didn't stop. He continued to read, to study, to dream, every night. He imagined the day when he would walk back into a classroom, older, wiser, successful, and show people like Mrs. Thompson that no one could measure his potential but him. The irony was that Mrs. Thompson believed she was teaching Marcus a lesson about limits, but the real lesson she gave him was about strength. Her disbelief became the wall he learned to climb. Her laughter became the fuel he used to keep running, and one day, she would see that the dream she mocked was not only possible, it was inevitable. The sound of laughter echoed in Marcus's ears long after the teacher had moved on with the lesson. At first, it had started as a few giggles, quiet enough that Marcus hoped they would fade, but instead, they grew louder, spreading from one corner of the classroom to the other like wildfire. It was not the warm, friendly laughter that people share when something is genuinely funny. It was sharp, mocking, and filled with cruelty. One boy leaned across his desk and whispered to the girl sitting beside him, loud enough for Marcus to hear. "Did you hear him? Harvard, he thinks he's some genius." The girl burst out laughing, covering her mouth with her hand. Another student in the back pretended to raise his hand and mimic Marcus's voice, exaggerating every word. "Excuse me, I want to go to Harvard," he said, puffing out his chest. The room erupted in more laughter. Marcus sat frozen. His eyes stayed on the front of the classroom, but he could feel the weight of every pair of eyes staring at him. His face burned, his ears rang, and his chest felt like it was being crushed by invisible hands. He tried to swallow, but his throat was too tight. He wanted to disappear, to sink into the floor and never come back. The teacher didn't stop them. In fact, her smirk seemed to encourage the noise. The class had found a new target, and Marcus was it. Every time someone whispered Harvard under their breath, the others snickered, and the cycle repeated again and again. For Marcus, the minutes stretched into hours, each second filled with shame and humiliation. During recess, the cruelty continued. On the playground, a group of boys gathered near the basketball court. "Hey, Mr. Harvard," one of them called out. "Why don't you show us your fancy lawyer moves?" They laughed so hard that some doubled over. Marcus walked past them without saying a word, his fists clenched tightly inside his pockets. His silence only seemed to fuel them more. "What's wrong, Marcus?" another boy teased. "Too busy studying for your Harvard exam." Some students weren't as loud, but they still contributed in quieter ways. A few rolled their eyes whenever Marcus walked by. Others exchanged knowing smirks, as if they all shared a secret joke about him. Even those who didn't laugh outright avoided him, afraid of being mocked themselves if they showed any support. In just one day, Marcus had become an outsider in his own classroom. At lunch, Marcus carried his tray to a corner table, hoping to eat in peace, but the whispers followed him there. Two girls sitting nearby leaned close to each other and whispered loudly enough for him to catch. "Can you believe he thinks he's smart enough for Harvard?" one said. The other giggled. "He'll be lucky to even pass this class." Their words stabbed at him more deeply than they realized. Marcus stared at his food, pushing it around with his fork. His appetite was gone. He thought about throwing the tray away, but he didn't want to stand up and walk past more stairs. So he sat quietly, chewing slowly, pretending not to hear. That night, when Marcus returned home, the laughter still echoed in his head. He sat on his bed with his knees pulled to his chest, replaying every cruel word. He remembered the way the boy had puffed out his chest, mimicking him. The way the girls had whispered at lunch. The way everyone had laughed without hesitation. For a few painful moments, Marcus doubted himself. Maybe they were right. Maybe Harvard was too big, too far, too impossible for someone like him. His teacher thought so. His classmates thought so. Was it foolish to believe otherwise? He pressed his hands against his eyes, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. But then he remembered something. He remembered the hours he had spent in the library, the nights he stayed awake reading while the rest of the world slept. He remembered the way his mother looked at him when he told her about his dream. The pride in her eyes even when she didn't say much. He remembered the excitement he felt when he first discovered Harvard's history. The belief that education could open doors no one else could close. Slowly, Marcus lowered his hands and whispered to himself, "They can laugh all they want, but I won't stop." His voice was shaky, but the words gave him strength. He repeated them again, louder this time, "I won't stop." The next day at school, the teasing continued, but Marcus reacted differently. When one boy whispered Harvard as he passed by, Marcus kept walking with his head held higher. When another mocked his dream during math class, Marcus ignored him completely and focused on solving the problem on the board. He refused to give them the reaction they wanted. His silence was no longer filled with shame, but with quiet defiance. The laughter didn't fade immediately, but something began to shift. A few classmates grew bored when Marcus didn't react. Their jokes lost their power when he refused to let them pierce his spirit. Still, others continued. But Marcus had made up his mind. Their laughter would not define him. Late one afternoon, while walking home, Marcus passed a group of students from his school. They pointed and snickered. One of them shouted, "Hey Harvard, when are you going to your big university?" Marcus stopped for a moment, looked straight at them, and simply said, "One day." Then he turned and walked away. His words were calm, steady, and filled with quiet confidence. The group fell silent, unsure how to respond. The classmates' laughter had been cruel, it had been loud, and it had been painful. But instead of crushing Marcus, it hardened him. It turned into the background noise of his journey. Always there, always reminding him of the obstacles ahead. But beneath it, his dream burned brighter than ever. Marcus understood something most of his classmates didn't. Laughter fades, but determination lasts. And while they were busy laughing at his dream, he was busy building it. Brick by brick, page by page, step by step. It was a Tuesday morning, gray clouds drifting lazily across the sky as rain tapped softly against the school windows. The classroom buzzed with its usual noise. The scraping of chairs, the rustle of papers, the whispers that darted back and forth between students. For Marcus, it was just another day of enduring the stares and smirks that followed him ever since he had dared to say the word Harvard. Mrs. Thompson stood at the front of the class, writing math problems on the chalkboard. Her voice carried its usual sharpness as she explained fractions. But Marcus barely listened. His mind was far away, lost in the vision of Harvard's red brick buildings, the dream he carried like a secret flame inside him. Then, something unusual happened. The classroom door creaked open, all eyes turned, expecting perhaps a late student or another teacher. Instead, a tall man stepped in, dressed in a dark suit that seemed out of place in the worn-down classroom. His presence was commanding, his posture straight, his expression calm but purposeful. He carried a leather briefcase in one hand, and his eyes scanned the room with quiet authority. The room fell into sudden silence. Even the class clowns froze in their seats. Mrs. Thompson turned around, clearly startled. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice unusually polite. The man gave a small smile. "Good morning, I'm Dr. Williams," he said. His voice was smooth, confident, but kind. "I'm a dean from Harvard University. I'm here to meet a student named Marcus." Gasps filled the room. A ripple of shock swept through the class like a wave. Students exchanged wide-eyed looks, mouths hanging open in disbelief. Did he just say Harvard? Did he just ask for Marcus? Marcus himself sat frozen, his heart thundering in his chest. For a moment, he thought he must have misheard. Maybe this was some kind of cruel trick. But the man's eyes landed on him, steady and warm. "You must be Marcus," Dr. Williams said, his smile widening slightly. The silence was so heavy it felt like the entire building was holding its breath. Even Mrs. Thompson looked pale. Her usual stern expression cracked with confusion. She cleared her throat, her voice shaky for the first time. "Yes, well, Marcus is one of my students," she said quickly. But her sentence trailed off. Dr. Williams stepped forward, placing his briefcase gently on the teacher's desk. He didn't look at her. His focus remained on Marcus. "I came across an essay written by Marcus," he explained to the class. "It was submitted to a regional competition, and when I read it, I was deeply moved. His words, his vision, his determination. They spoke louder than most adults I've met in my career. I wanted to meet him personally." The classroom was dead silent. No one laughed this time. No one dared whisper. Every pair of eyes swung between Marcus and the Harvard dean. Marcus felt his throat tighten, his palms sweating. He struggled to form words. "Why yes, sir, I'm Marcus," he managed to say softly. Dr. Williams nodded. "I thought so," he said with warmth. "I just wanted to tell you, Marcus, don't let anyone, and I mean anyone, tell you your dream is too big. Harvard was built by dreamers, and it welcomes dreamers who are willing to work hard and rise above the noise. And you, young man, have already proven that you belong among them." The words washed over Marcus like a tide of light. His chest swelled with something he hadn't felt in days. Pride, validation, hope. His classmates stared at him in stunned silence. The same ones who had laughed the loudest now sat with their mouths closed, unable to process what was happening. Mrs. Thompson fidgeted behind her desk, her face flushed. She forced a stiff smile. Well, Dr. Williams, Marcus does try, of course, but Harvard is very competitive. Her voice faltered. She looked like she wanted to shrink into the floor. Dr. Williams glanced at her briefly, his eyes sharp. Yes, competitive, he agreed. But that doesn't mean impossible. Teachers should be the first to encourage ambition, not the first to crush it. I hope that lesson isn't lost here. His words were gentle, but firm. The message was clear. The room went even quieter. Some students looked down at their desks, ashamed. Others looked at Marcus with something new in their eyes. Respect. Even those who had mocked him most fiercely now avoided his gaze, unable to meet the boy they had underestimated. Marcus swallowed hard, his voice trembling as he said, "Thank you, sir." His words were small, but his heart shouted with joy. This moment, this unbelievable moment, felt like the universe itself stepping in to defend his dream. Dr. Williams placed a card on Marcus's desk. "This is my contact information," he said. "Keep working hard, keep believing. Harvard will always have a place for students who refuse to give up." And just like that, he turned and left, his footsteps echoing down the hall, leaving behind a stunned classroom. For several seconds, no one moved. The air felt heavy with something unspoken. Marcus sat frozen, staring at the card in front of him, his hands trembling as he picked it up. His classmates finally exhaled, the whispers beginning again. But they were not mocking whispers this time. They were filled with awe. "Did you hear that?" One student whispered. "A Harvard dean came here, for Marcus." Another shook their head. "I can't believe it." The same boys who had laughed at him on the playground now stared at him like he was someone entirely new. Marcus finally looked up, his eyes locked with Mrs. Thompson's. For once, she had no smirk, no dismissive tone. Her face was pale, her lips pressed tight. She looked away first, unable to hold his gaze. Marcus felt something powerful rise within him, stronger than the shame he had carried, stronger than the laughter he had endured. It was the knowledge that his dream was real, that it mattered, and that even someone from Harvard believed in him. The very place his teacher had said was impossible had just walked through the door and asked for him. That moment changed everything. The classroom that had once been filled with laughter at his expense was now filled with silence, respect, and the undeniable truth that Marcus's dream was not a joke. It was destiny in the making. The door closed softly behind Dr. Williams, his footsteps fading down the hallway, yet the weight of his presence lingered in the classroom like a storm cloud that had passed but left the air heavy and charged. For a long moment, no one spoke, no one moved. The silence was so thick that even the sound of chalk rolling off the teacher's desk made the students jump. Marcus sat perfectly still, the dean's card gripped tightly in his hand. His heart was still racing, his palms still damp. His mind replayed the words over and over. "Harvard welcomes dreamers. You belong among them." Those sentences were now carved into his memory, words of hope that replaced the sting of mockery. The same classmates who had laughed at him only yesterday stared with wide eyes. Their mouths hung slightly open, some in shock, some in disbelief. The whispers began slowly, cautious at first. "Did that really just happen?" One girl muttered under her breath. "A dean from Harvard, here, for Marcus." Another boy added, shaking his head as if he still didn't believe it. For the first time, Marcus felt the eyes of the room not as weapons, but as witnesses. They weren't mocking him now. They were studying him, almost with awe. The smirks had vanished, replaced by something softer, something that almost looked like respect. But the most striking reaction came from Mrs. Thompson. The teacher who had ridiculed Marcus's dream now stood frozen at the front of the class. Her face was pale, her lips pressed tightly together, and for once her sharp eyes were wide. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but no words came out. She adjusted her glasses, fumbled with the chalk in her hand, then placed it back down with a nervous clink. The silence in the room stretched on. It was not the kind of silence that came from boredom or routine. It was a silence of realization, of shifting ground. Everyone in that room knew something extraordinary had just happened, something that could not be denied. Marcus finally let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He glanced down at the card in his hand again, tracing the embossed letters with his thumb. It felt heavier than paper, heavier than ink. It felt like a promise, like proof that his dream had weight in the real world. A boy in the back of the room finally broke the silence. "Yo, Marcus," he whispered, but this time there was no mockery in his tone. It was almost respectful, tentative, as if speaking to someone important. Another student leaned closer to him and muttered, "Man, Harvard actually came for him." Their voices were filled with or instead of laughter. Marcus looked up slowly, his gaze swept across the classroom, meeting the eyes of those who had once jeered at him. He saw the change, the shift. They weren't laughing anymore. They couldn't, because reality itself had silenced them. Mrs. Thompson finally cleared her throat, trying to gather herself. "All right, class," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "Let's get back to work." But even she knew her authority had cracked. Her words carried no weight compared to the moment they had all just witnessed. The students obediently turned back to their notebooks, but the atmosphere was far from normal. Pens scratched across paper half-heartedly. Eyes kept drifting back to Marcus. The classroom that had once been a place of humiliation for him had now become a stage where he had been vindicated. Marcus sat straighter in his chair, not out of arrogance, but out of relief, out of pride. His silence now was different from before. It wasn't the silence of shame or defeat. It was the silence of strength. The silence of someone who no longer needed to prove himself with words. The evidence had walked through the door in a suit and spoken for him. The rest of the school day felt strange. The usual noise, laughter, and gossip seemed muted. In the hallway, students whispered as Marcus passed. Some pointed, but not with ridicule this time. It was curiosity, amazement, even admiration. A few even gave him small nods, as if acknowledging something they had never seen in him before. At lunch, the table where he usually sat alone didn't feel quite as lonely. A boy from his class hesitated before walking over. "Hey, Marcus," he said quietly. "That was crazy. You must feel good right now." Marcus gave a small smile. "Yeah," he said simply. He didn't need to say more. The moment spoke for itself. Even after the final bell rang and Marcus walked home, the silence from earlier followed him, not a heavy silence anymore, but a powerful one. It was the kind of silence that comes after a storm, when the air is fresh and alive with possibility. He replayed the scene in his mind again and again. The door opening, the dean stepping in, the class frozen in shock, Mrs. Thompson's pale face, his own name spoken with respect. At home, Marcus's mother immediately noticed the glow on his face. "What happened today?" she asked curiously. Marcus handed her the card, his voice trembling with excitement as he told her the story. Tears filled her eyes as she hugged him tightly. "I told you," she whispered into his hair. "Your dream is real. Don't ever let anyone take it away from you." That night, as Marcus lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the silence returned once more. But this time it wasn't empty. It was full of the possibilities that lay ahead, full of the quiet strength that comes from being proven right when the world doubted you. He whispered to himself, "They can laugh, they can doubt, but I know where I'm going." And with that, he drifted to sleep, the sound of silence comforting him like a promise of the future.